Thank you. Thank you, Theo, for that nice introduction. The organization I work for, ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, as I said yesterday, we do livestock research for development across Africa and Asia. And we are a CGIAR center, a family of agricultural research centers across mainly the developing world. You're not going to get anything high-pitched from me. I hope my voice will hold out, and but hopefully you'll still pay attention, as Theo has mentioned, and hopefully I'm not going to give you too much annoying repetition. Having said that, perhaps there's advantages and disadvantages to coming at the end, as it were, and perhaps too I also have among the easiest topics. It's a bit easier to talk about livelihoods and the like that I'm going to talk about, perhaps slightly less controversial, but it's also difficult because those things are really hard to measure, and perhaps we'll show that during this presentation. I've tried to assemble as much as possible evidence and science, and I've put a lot of it on the slides, but I'm not going to talk about those details, so you get that afterwards as well. The machinery collaborating. Can we try this? None of the machinery collaborating. That one? No? Try that. Oh, we got a third option. All options. So I've got to use it. Oh, now it goes. Okay. Sorry, I need to go back here. I got this fantastic title, but actually when I asked Per, what do you want me to talk about? He said, well, we want to know about the role of meat and animals in social and economic and cultural aspects, especially in the global south. So that's really what I'm going to talk about, despite the fancy title that I got. I'll give a few remarks of context, and I will touch on food system a little bit in that. And then I'm going to try and unpack a bit some of these other aspects, foods and jobs and income, assets, insurance, education, culture, gender, economics. And just close with looking at some connections and trade-offs and synergies. Context matters. So here's my attempt to respond to that food system bit in the title. This graphic, these little bubbles, is from the UN Nutrition discussion paper that came out last year that was on livestock-derived foods and sustainable healthy diets. And I really like it because it helps us sort of emphasize some of that difference that we see between high and lower income countries. If you sort of go from the middle bubble outwards, when we're at the level of nutrients, not too much dispute when we talk about nutrients. We know molecules that are important for people to eat in order to be healthy and well. But as we move out, when we start to talk about food, or especially diets, we find that things start to look incredibly different across the world. We find places where you have lots of food choice, and it's up to you, the diet that you may choose to eat. We find other places where there's very little food choice. Despite the fact you may know what's good to eat, you may not be able to afford it or have access to it. And as Theo just mentioned, when we start to look at the food system, the production, the processing, transport, consumption of food, we find that in high-income countries, that's very distant from the supermarket shelves. If we say livestock, we find people have this image of perhaps a piece of meat on the shelf or a bottle of milk. But in lower middle income countries, when you say livestock, it's something much, much more integral to lives and to livelihoods. And those are some of the things I want to try and unpack today. And I just put this slide in because as I was reading around for this presentation, it seemed to me that we often use some of these terms a little bit loosely and get ourselves into trouble. Sometimes we say meat and animals almost interchangeably. And as I'm going to show, animals are much, much more than meat for many people in the world. We sometimes equate meat and beef. And in fact, only about 20% of the world's meat is beef. Sometimes we talk about protein and we think that means meat as well. But of course, meat is much, much more than protein, as we heard in the session yesterday morning. It's micronutrients that you really can't get any other way. We also hear of this sustainable diet being interpreted to mean greenhouse gases, sometimes only methane. And of course, sustainability has many other dimensions. Even if you talk about environment, it's water and biodiversity and land, but it's also about economic and social sustainability as well. And sometimes we interchange these words, intensification and industrialization. We can do a lot with so-called sustainable intensification without switching fully to industrial production systems relying on grain, etc., etc. And that's some of the things that we're looking at across the lower middle income countries. I found this to be illustrative. The bars here, the dark bar is the percent of the world's total cattle in these different parts of the world. And the orange bar is the percent of the world's beef that's produced in those different parts of the world. It's just numbers from FAO stat. You can see the USA, the EU, Brazil producing lots of beef, but having perhaps lower amounts of the percent of cattle in the world. When we come to Africa, it's completely the other way around. Not so much of the beef being produced, but much more in terms of the percent of the world's cattle. So what's going on? And I just highlight a couple of things, probably lots of things going on. One is the productivity is low. So you're not getting a lot of beef for the number of animals that you've got. But it's also about the other roles that those animals are playing. And those are some of the things I'm going to have a look at hopefully now. About 1 in 6 people on the planet derive some kind of livelihood benefit from livestock. Probably over 500 million are totally dependent on livestock for their livelihoods day by day. So let's have a look around food, first of all. We mentioned it yesterday. I think demand for food will keep growing, but that growth is happening mainly in lower middle income countries. So these little graphics are looking at percentage change in demand between 2010 and 2030. And you can see the bars are highest for the animal products, not the cereals, and for the fruits and vegetables. And that's because as people get even a little richer, they tend to spend a little bit more money on these high value food products. But it doesn't mean that in most cases, people are over consuming. In 2018, the global average for meat in Africa was about 10 kilos per capita per year across Africa. In the OECD countries, it was around 60 or 70. Huge difference. As Alice mentioned yesterday, we do need to be aware of the double, triple burden at the same time. Another important point to note here is that 70% of those livestock-derived foods consumed at the moment in lower middle income countries are sourced in the so-called informal markets. That's really important for many reasons. It means that the people who are producing and selling can sell daily, they can get a little income, and that makes a big difference to livelihoods. It means that the people who are buying, who may not have very much cash in hand, can go and buy a small amount of animal product that can provide nutritious food. It does also mean that we need to pay huge attention to issues of food safety, not by banning those markets, but by finding ways to make them safer. And there's lots of ways that that can happen. This is just re-emphasizing, as people get richer, they consume more meat. You've got GDP per capita on the bottom and meat supply at the side. But note as well, yesterday we saw some lines across the graph at about 50 or 60 kilos as the recommendation. And you can see there's quite a lot that are above that. So where is this meat and milk coming from? This graph shows you the share of livestock-derived foods coming from farms that are less than 20 hectares. And you can see across Africa and Asia, that's over 70%. But it's also important to note that about half the cereals are also coming from these same small integrated farms where you couldn't produce these staple foods without livestock in the system. And those are the circular bioeconomy, if you like, that we talked about yesterday. The mixed crop livestock farms, they're already working like that. We need to do a lot to improve, but that's already what's feeding lots of people. And we heard of several 100 million who are in those systems, and they're relying on livestock for multiple development objectives. So let's have a look at employment. Agriculture dominates employment in lower middle income countries. You can see the dark shading on this, and almost every graph we put up seems to have dark shading in these parts of the world for whatever it is we're trying to measure. But let's unpack that about employment a little bit here. This shows the total population, so the whole bar. The non-working is in the dark color, the orange color is the workforce, and then in the pale, what is that, yellow or mustard or something, is the agricultural workforce, and the blue is the livestock workforce. You can see in the US, in the UK, you can't see the agricultural workforce on the graph even. In the EU, you've got quite a chunk that's in processing. And when we look here now, I put the example of Kenya, you can see about half of the total workforce are involved in agriculture. And of that half of them are involved in livestock production. So in terms of quantity, big differences across the world when we talk about employment. But it's also qualitatively different as well. In high-income economies, we find that most of the livestock sector jobs are formal salaried jobs. They're in processing, retail, trade, not very many probably on the farm level. In contrast, in the lower income countries, much less formality, unsalaried jobs, a lot of family labor still, raising animals on farms, rangelands, sometimes local processing of the products. So how do we get some numbers about livestock and livelihoods across the world? And it's, as I say, it's pretty difficult. So I've drawn quite heavily on the study that I put the reference here that looked at about, I think it was over 3,000 publications and did all those fancy literature survey and assessment things and pulled out about, I think it was around 40 that had real quantitative information about when you invest in livestock, what does that mean for livelihoods? And they looked in particular at things like livestock transfers. You've probably heard of those from some of the NGOs where you have an animal and you pass on when it has a baby, you pass it on to somebody else, and that way many people in the community start to get animals. You can enhance livestock markets and engagement with markets through things like cooperatives and so on. And you can do things that try and strengthen the resilience of livestock keeping communities. And in all those examples, they were able to show, and I'll show a little bit of this information, improvements in incomes, improvements in assets and savings, better insurance or risk mitigation, and opportunities for gender as well. And I'll say a bit more about gender in a short while. Now, I'm supposed to do something to make this video work. This is just so you don't have to listen to me all the time. I have to click actually. Oops. It's great. Escape now. I can get out of this. Hopefully go to the next slide. I don't want to play it again. Help. We thought we were going to test the technology. Now I really want to. Help. Go to the next slide so it doesn't play there. Sorry, folks. I knew I was going to test the technology, but I thought it was worth a little interlude. Okay. This is one of those slides where I'm not going to talk about the details, just to say that, yes, there is some information that livestock contribute to smallholder incomes. Between 12 and 15% often reported, but in pastoral systems, which you could imagine, up to at least 40% of household income coming from livestock. Uh-oh, John. Here we go. Some of those different examples, livestock transfers that pass on the gift, good data on increased revenue, increased income, and reducing the numbers of households below the poverty line, market-based interventions, supporting cattle fattening, dairy hubs, increasing both the dairy produced, but also household incomes, and interventions that strengthen resilience. I'll talk a little bit more about one of those in a moment. Household insurance, supporting welfare, and even in the very poorest households, in Bangladesh, with poultry interventions, an increase in income. We're often told that, well, you can't do very much if they're really, really poor. But yes, you can. When we talk about assets, we found that those kinds of interventions also increased assets. And that's important because animal assets can really help to stop poor families descending into poverty and really becoming destitute. But they can also enable families to step out of poverty and perhaps even go on to other enterprises, if you like. I think somebody talked about that yesterday. This pie here on the left, you have cause of livestock mortality during drought in Kenya. You can see almost 3/4 of that is livestock there, is caused by drought. And if you look at how much of the income that's making up, this is the 40%. It's the blue and the red slices of that. So 40% of your income coming from livestock. If there's a drought, you are going to lose a lot of animals, and that's going to have a huge impact. So we find that households rely on, for example, sales of animals to cope with food shortages or medical expenses, etc. And in Kenya, we've been, and actually in Ethiopia now as well, working on something called index-based livestock insurance that's based on satellite imagery of the forage. And it says when the forage drops below a certain level, that triggers the insurance payout. So you're not going to run around the rangelands trying to count animals and see who died and who didn't. And when families have that, we find really positive results, less distress sales. They don't reduce the size of meals and less dependent on food aid. So very positive results from that strengthening resilience intervention. Yesterday morning, we talked a lot about cognitive development, and livestock foods are really important for that cognitive development of infants and young children. Noting as well that these are rather small people, so they can't eat huge quantities of everything. But if you have a small quantity of animal source foods, they can cope with that. We had a graphic I was showing somebody yesterday where we had, to get the same amount of vitamin A, you could have 1 egg or you could have 12 carrots. Well, try and get a kid to eat 12 carrots. That's going to be a challenge. But of course, because livestock investments also increase income, families are able to buy a much more diverse diet. So the whole family gets better nourished as well. And livestock sales and income are also used to pay for education, to pay for school fees, books, uniforms. But I just put a little PS there because we do need to keep it in mind. In some cases, children are involved in that family labor I mentioned for livestock, and we need to be aware of that and help to support families to transition away from those kind of things. This is a really nice and very recent example that came out just this year that makes rather nicely this link with nutrition. So this was in Western Kenya, where the chickens were vaccinated against Newcastle disease. And they found that the kids in those families had 24% higher protein intake, and they grew better, not surprisingly. But of course, we know if they grow better, that also is an indication they're not stunted. It's closely linked to cognitive ability as well. So we know those kids are also going to learn better. Somebody mentioned it, I think yesterday, without a dowry, many people across the world can't even get married or even think about getting married. I mentioned earlier this circular economy where manure, traction, income enables farmers to grow crops, and the crops that are grown, they provide food, but 70% of the feed for the animals is coming from the leftovers of the crops as well. As we said, many are unable to nourish their children, celebrate a feast, or even recognize the passing of a loved one. And it's not just across the developing world. No Christmas or Thanksgiving, no turkey. Even in sporting events, rodeos in the US or the Nadam in Mongolia, whatever, huge roles of animals in culture. A word about gender. In rural areas, 2/3 of livestock keepers are women, and they may often be, animal can often be the only asset that a woman is able to own. They may not be able to have a title deed, but they can own an animal. And of course, instrumental to a woman's household role in supporting nutrition and making decisions about how you manage some of those risks and trade-offs and so on. I like to say it this way, for most women in high-income countries, engagement in livestock enterprises is an option. In lower and middle-income countries, it's a necessity in many cases. And just a final word on GDP. So now we're going to the national levels. Well, actually, globally, livestock contribute 40% of agricultural GDP, a bit higher in high-income countries, a huge range in lower middle-income economies, but it's often growing. And as economies grow, the proportion of agriculture in total GDP tends to shrink, but livestock, part of that agricultural GDP, tends to increase. But we often find that some of those hard-to-measure pieces are not even included in that equation. I just made this little graphic to remind us that all the pieces we're talking about, the nutrition part, the environment part, and the sort of social and economic part of today are very much intimately connected. And I just put a few ideas here, which I'm not going to talk about, as to some of those interconnections between these pieces. So livestock matters are often bundled within agriculture. So we find it quite hard to make the case because you get a number for agriculture, but you can't find out what does livestock look like in that. And some of these things that I've been talking about are quite hard to measure. As I said, not a lot of quantitative evidence to support the case. But as we've seen, they're very connected to livelihoods, to well-being, as much as the nutrition, as much as the environment. All these pieces need to come together. So we need to think about trade-offs, synergies, and make sure that we're able to grasp emerging opportunities, as well as to avoid unintended consequences. We've got to keep these pieces in the picture. So we had several comments yesterday about this idea of, well, let's get away from a polarized discussion. And I like to use this slide to make the point that we might be able to agree, no matter who we are or how we see the world, we might be able to agree on where we're trying to get to. But because of the diversity, some of which I hope I've illustrated now, the pathway to get there may look extremely different. So affordable, accessible, balanced, nutritious diets that include being able to choose milk, meat, eggs. Perhaps somebody here might choose to exclude those products from their diet, go to the pharmacy and get some supplements. They do it for the benefit of their health, perhaps the environment. A woman in India may give her child a glass of milk every day. She's doing it for the same reason, the benefit of nutrition and health, but it looks so very different. That's just my one. We all want healthy animals and safe food and healthy people. In some places that might mean regulations. In others, it might mean improving those informal markets, for example. We want to make sure that every citizen, every nation is able to benefit fully from sustainable livestock systems and solutions. But how we get there is happening from very different starting places around the world. We want livestock development to be inclusive, fair, equitable. Again, it's going to look different in different parts of the world and in different livestock systems. We want efficient, low carbon livestock systems that enhance and not harm the environment. In some cases, that might mean we're going to start to use additives, or we're going to breed for low methane animals. Where I'm based, it probably means we're going to do a lot with production efficiency and the technologies that help with that. And we want a healthy planet with rich biodiversity, sustainable water use. So when we put these things together, I think it's important that we're not blind advocates for livestock, but that we recognize there's a huge diversity and that it's incumbent on all of us to move towards change. As we said, the polarized, dichotomous debates, all livestock or no livestock, are not going to be helpful, but they can cause the public to get confused and perhaps to pick up those sound bites that could be misleading. So that aspect of communication is really important. And all of us need to recognize the diverse views, scrutinize our own ideas, and acknowledge that we do all need to work together for sustainable livestock in the future. Thank you very much.